Okay, so lately, it really feels like you can't avoid the whole discussion around tariffs.
Oh, absolutely. It's
Okay.
everywhere.
And you hear such different takes. One
Mm.
person says, oh, it makes foreign companies pay.
Mm.
And the next person is adamant, nope, it's just a tax on us, the consumers. It's kind of dizzying trying to figure it out.
It really is.
Yeah.
And what's interesting, I think, is how quickly it gets boiled down to these, like, simple sound bites
Exactly.
when the actual economics behind tariffs, way, way more complicated than that.
Right. So that's what we want to do today. Forget the quick takes and the political spin for a bit.
Yeah, let's park that.
We're doing a deep dive into that core question. Who really ends up paying for tariffs?
Mm.
Our goal isn't about picking a side here. It's more about unpacking the sort of mechanics involved, trying to bring some clarity.
Definitely, because that idea that it's just simple.
Yeah.
Either the producer pays or the consumer pays. It's just, well, it's too simple. If it were that easy, we wouldn't have, entire fields of economics trying to understand international trade.
Good point.
The reality is, a tariff sends ripples through the market. And who feels those ripples depends on a whole bunch of factors working together.
Okay. Let's try and break this down then. Let's imagine, say, a product coming from China costs $10. Simple enough.
$10 base price.
Then, boom, 100% tariff gets slapped on it. So the moment it enters the country, the price tag effectively jumps to $20.
Yep, double the price at the port.
So the big question is, who eats that extra $10? Does the seller back in China just make less profit? Or does that cost just get passed straight through to the folks buying it here?
Exactly. And to figure that out, you really have to think about, well, what other choices do buyers have?
Ah, the competition.
Precisely. Is there another company, maybe domestic, maybe from another country, selling something similar? Often, these cheaper imports got popular in the first place because they were cheaper than the existing options.
That makes sense. Okay, so let's play out a scenario. Scenario one. Even with that big 100% tariff, that Chinese product, now at $20, it's still the cheapest thing on the shelf compared to anything else.
Mm-hmm. Still the best deal around.
What happens then?
Well, in that situation, the key thing is
Huh.
consumers are probably going to keep buying it, right?
Yeah, I suppose so. If it's still the cheapest.
Because it still represents the best value for their money, even at $20. So yeah, they're paying more than before, $20 instead of $10, but they're still picking the most affordable option.
So the consumer basically pays the tariff.
In effect, yes. The consumer bears the cost. And what this also shows is a tariff in this specific case. It doesn't really stop the import.
Right.
It acts more like a direct revenue source for the government imposing it. It's essentially a tax on consuming that foreign good, which is still the preferred choice.
Okay, got it. If it's still the cheapest, people grumble but pay. But
Huh.
what if there's a really close alternative? Say, another company sells a similar widget, but it costs just a tiny bit more than the original Chinese price, like $10.01.
Okay, now this is where it gets interesting. This is where the dynamic really shifts.
How so?
Because suddenly, that $20 tariff Chinese widget doesn't look so good anymore next to a $10 or one option.
Yeah, you'd probably switch.
Exactly. Consumers are much more likely to say, well, I'll take the $10.01 one, thanks. So the Chinese seller looks at this and thinks, uh-oh, I'm going to lose all my sales.
Right.
So they now have a really strong reason to lower their price. They might have to eat a big chunk of that $10 tariff, maybe even all of it,
Just to stay in the game.
just to stay competitive against that $10.01 product.
Yeah.
That willingness of consumers to switch based on the economists call price elasticity of demand.
Okay.
And the demand is highly elastic, meaning people really react to price changes. Even a small tariff can cause a big shift in who buys what.
So in that case, scenario two, it's really the seller overseas who's paying the tariff by cutting into their own profits.
Pretty much, yes.
Okay.
They absorb the cost. The key takeaway here, really, is that the price difference between the product with the tariff and its closest competitors, that's the crucial factor.
It dictates who ends up footing the bill.
Exactly. It's not just about who writes the check at customs.
Okay, now you mentioned competitors, and you said it's probably not another company from the same country because they'd face the same tariff.
Right, generally speaking.
So in the real world, who are these competitors? Because it feels like the answer to that could really change the outcome, couldn't it?
Oh, hugely. It absolutely does. And if we link this back to why tariffs are being imposed in the first place, like what's the government's goal?
Mm-hmm.
The type of competition really depends on that goal. Are they trying to, say, bring manufacturing jobs back home?
Okay.
Or is the goal maybe just to shift sourcing away from one specific country like China, maybe
Mm.
diversify?
Those are different goals.
Very different goals involving different sets of competitors.
Okay, let's tackle the first one then. Bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. In that situation, who are we talking about as competitors?
So in this case, the competitor we're hoping consumers switch to is specifically an American company making a similar product here.
Got it.
And the tariff isn't necessarily just on China. It might be on whoever the cheapest global producer is for that particular good.
Okay, so let's use an example. Maybe higher-end clothes, where, say, a shirt made in China might be a bit cheaper than one made in the U.S., but maybe not massively cheaper.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
High-end clothing, maybe some home furnishings, appliances, things where the price difference might be noticeable but not enormous.
So what happens when a tariff hits the Chinese shirt?
Well, what's fascinating here is if that price gap before the tariff was pretty small,
Yeah.
then a tariff that just pushes the Chinese shirt's price slightly above the American one, that could be enough to make a lot of consumers switch.
Just nudge them over the edge.
Exactly. So to avoid losing all those sales, the sellers in China, they'd likely have to cut their prices quite a bit. They end up absorbing most of that tariff.
Okay.
So the impact on U.S. consumers might actually be pretty small, maybe a slight price increase overall. But the intended benefit is, hopefully, those clothing manufacturing jobs potentially coming back to the U.S.
Right, making the U.S. option more attractive.
It's less about attacking the foreign producer directly and more about, strategically tilting the playing field just enough at the margin.
Okay, that sounds, well, potentially good for the U.S. in that scenario. So why not just do that everywhere? Really high tariffs on everything to bring all the jobs back.
Well, that raises a really important point about the practical limits here.
Okay.
Even in this good scenario,
Yeah.
just cranking up tariffs indefinitely isn't really feasible, at least not immediately. Why? Because U.S. manufacturing probably doesn't have the capacity right now to suddenly make everything everyone wants to buy.
Right. Supply can't keep up.
Exactly. If tariffs were super high, but U.S. factories couldn't produce enough, what happens? Consumers would still have to buy the imported goods just at those much higher tariff-inflated prices.
So it backfires.
It could. So the strategic thinking here for the U.S. is probably more about setting tariff levels high enough to create that preference for domestic goods, but doing it in a measured way, kind of gradually, allowing U.S. manufacturing time to actually scale up and meet that demand.
Okay, so the balancing act, got it. Now, what about that other scenario you mentioned? The goal isn't necessarily bringing all production back home, but maybe just shifting away from relying so heavily on one country, like China.
Right, diversifying the supply chain.
Who are the competitors in that situation?
In this case, the competitors are likely other lower-priced producers. Think countries like India, Vietnam, maybe the Philippines, Mexico, places that also have lower labor costs than the U.S. Let's take an example like really low-cost clothing, basic plastic stuff, daily necessities, things that are very labor-intensive.
Right, things where the price difference between China and, say, Vietnam might not be that huge to begin with?
Exactly, or at least significantly less than the difference between either of them in the U.S.
So what happens when we put a tariff on the Chinese goods here? Does manufacturing come back to the U.S.?
Probably not much, no. Even with big tariffs on China, it's unlikely to cause a big return of that kind of manufacturing to the U.S. simply because U.S. labor costs are still much, much higher.
So where does it go?
Well, what's interesting, and what we often see, is that the manufacturing tends to just migrate. It shifts to those other low-cost countries.
Like Vietnam, for instance.
Exactly. So
Yeah.
U.S. consumers, they might see a small price increase as these supply chains reconfigure themselves.
Oh, okay.
But they're still likely going to choose the cheaper imports coming from Vietnam or Mexico rather than suddenly switching to a much more expensive American-made version.
So the tariff doesn't really achieve the bring jobs home goal in this case. It just shuffles the jobs around elsewhere.
Pretty much. So the strategic implication for the U.S. here is different. You have to recognize that tariffs alone probably won't work for this type of product if the goal is domestic production.
So what's the alternative?
Well, a potentially more effective strategy, if the real goal is diversifying away from China, is to be more proactive. Actively negotiate trade agreements with those other potential manufacturing hubs, Vietnam, India, Mexico.
How would that help?
You offer them incentives, better access to the U.S. market, maybe investment help. things like that. In return, you ask them to help attract those industries shifting out of China.
Ah, okay.
And, crucially, you get commitments from them to prevent what's called transshipment, basically, making sure Chinese goods aren't just being slightly modified or relabeled there and sent on to the U.S. to avoid the tariffs.
Right, closing loopholes. So it's more about diplomacy and partnership with other nations.
Exactly, working with other countries to build up genuine alternatives.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, there's a third situation, isn't there? What about goods where China is just dominant, where the price difference is massive and there aren't really any good alternatives anywhere else in the world, like certain electronics, maybe toys, specific components?
Yes, and this is arguably the most complex and challenging scenario.
Why is that?
Because if the price difference between, say, an electronic gadget made in China and anything comparable made anywhere else, including the U.S., is potentially several times higher,
Yeah.
then even pretty significant tariffs might not be enough to make consumers switch. They'll likely just keep buying the Chinese product because the cost saving is still so huge, even with the tariff.
Ouch. So in that case, who pays the tariff?
Overwhelmingly, in this scenario, the cost gets passed on.
Yeah.
It's largely borne by U.S. consumers paying higher prices.
And there's no real chance of that manufacturing coming back to the U.S.
Very little chance, realistically. Not without absolutely massive, probably unsustainable government subsidies or intervention. And even shifting that kind of complex production to other developing countries would take huge investment and a lot of time to build up the necessary skills and infrastructure. It's not a quick fix.
That sounds like a really tough spot for consumers then. So what's the strategic move for the U.S. government in that kind of situation? Is there one?
Well, it might sound a bit counterintuitive, but perhaps the most pragmatic approach in this specific case is to sort of accept the likelihood of transshipment happening, at least initially.
Accept it. How does that help?
Instead of trying to force the manufacturing back to the U.S. immediately, or even to a completely different primary producer, the goal might be to set tariff levels carefully.
How so?
You set them high enough that it actually incentivizes Chinese companies to route their goods through an intermediary country, make it more profitable for them to ship components to, say, Vietnam or Mexico for final assembly, packaging, or labeling.
Than it is to ship directly to the U.S. and pay the full tariff.
Exactly. The tariff needs to be high enough to create that incentive for rerouting, but maybe not so cripplingly high that the entire burden just crushes consumers from day one.
And what's the benefit of that rerouting?
Well, what's interesting is that this transshipment process itself can actually generate some economic activity jobs in logistics, packaging, final assembly in those intermediary countries.
Ah, okay. So it creates some value elsewhere.
Yes. And then maybe as a longer-term play, the U.S. could start to gradually apply tariffs further up the supply chain within those transshipping countries.
Oh, interesting.
Over time, that could encourage more genuine and comprehensive transfer of actual industrial capabilities as those intermediary nations start developing their own deeper manufacturing expertise beyond just final assembly. It's definitely a long-term, multi-step strategy. Not simple at all.
Wow. Okay, that paints a much more complicated picture than the simple who pays question we started with.
Doesn't it?
Yeah. So just to kind of recap, whether it's consumers or producers who pay a tariff, it's absolutely not black and white.
Not at all.
It really, really depends on that competitive landscape, right? And how sensitive consumers are to price changes for that specific type of product.
Exactly. We've talked through scenarios where, yeah, the consumer mostly pays. Scenarios where the overseas seller has to absorb the costs to stay competitive.
Right.
And scenarios where the main effect is actually shifting production patterns around the globe.
Whether it's high-end stuff where U.S. producers are almost competitive, or low-end goods where there are other cheap places to make them, or these really dominant products like electronics, the impact is totally different.
Absolutely. And these are the nuances, the complexities that just get completely lost in most public debates about tariffs.
Yeah, it really makes you think differently when you hear those discussions now. You have to look past the easy answers and try to see these underlying economic forces at work.
Definitely. Which kind of leads to a big final question, maybe something for listeners to chew on. Given all these complexities we've talked about, what are the most effective long-term strategies for countries trying to deal with these big global trade imbalances or trying to reshape their own domestic industries? If simple tariffs aren't always the answer, what is?
That's a really good question. Definitely more complicated than just picking consumers or producers.
It certainly is a multifaceted challenge that needs more than just a simple solution.